share screen, yeah.
Okay, so I've hit that, and we can work out how to. I suppose we should say, okay, we'll make the recording limited to the attendees, so that if people want to come back in and re-listen to any of the questions or the answers, or wherever, they can come back in, but we won't make it available more widely. Yeah.
Cool. Okay, so we might make a start if you're comfortable, Michael.
Yep.
Cool. Okay, well, thank you very much for everybody joining this session. My name is Lynn Crace. I'm a Professor of Economics and a Dean at the University of South Australia in Adelaide. It's great to see so many of you here. As part of my role as an academic, I've also been privileged to be leading a project which has operated in the last couple of years in Nepal, parts of India, parts of Northeast India and Bangladesh. That project was particularly interested in agricultural as a source of development. Many of you who are in the region would be aware that that particular part of the East-Gangetic Plain is critical for multiple reasons, not least of which because there's an extraordinarily large number of people there who are heavily dependent on agriculture. And the Australian government has had a view for some time that finding sustainable ways to be more intensive with agriculture in that region could offer some promise. Against that background, this project was interested in particular the sorts of institutional arrangements that may or may not support success in that part of the world. And as part of that, the first component of this project was to try and unravel, if you like, the institutional landscape. To do that, a colleague of ours, Bethany Cooper, ran a project which was a Delphi component, and this involved working with a wide range of policymakers to try and understand their conceptualisation of what was an effective policy, what was an effective program, what were the effective delivery instruments that were operating in the region. One of the things we found from that was that there was quite an extensive list that we managed to put together out of those conversations with policymakers that comprised probably between about 15 and 20 different common themes that kept coming up around types of policies and types of programs and types of delivery mechanisms. Just to bear in mind, with this particular project, we were quite keen not to constrain people's understanding of the word institutions. We felt that was really interesting academically, but in terms of practical usefulness, it was somewhat limited. So we left that pretty open-ended. But the consequence was that at the end, we then asked policymakers to try and rank the relative importance of those things. And for one reason or another, I mean, Avanish has a view as to how this has come about, but it was very, very difficult to extract meaningful rankings. So whilst we had sort of 15 or 20 things that people were saying were kind of important, when it came to pushing people to tell us, well, out of those, which is really important, it was pretty difficult to get an answer. And so with that in mind, what happened was we started to think about techniques that would be useful in exploring that a bit more seriously. And Michael, who has a considerable expertise in discrete choice design and discrete choice experiments, provided some advice that led us towards thinking about best worst scaling. Out of that, so this is a very long introduction, sorry for this. Out of that, we came to realise that there may be wider uses of this technique which people may find useful, and that's the context of this particular workshop. And so what we offered to do was to provide some materials to people in South Asia who may be interested in this technique. They may be researchers, they may be people from different backgrounds, they may be from government agencies or whatever. And so the purpose of this workshop is to provide people an opportunity to just query Michael in particular around the technique, how it's applied, whether there's gaps. The videos that he's put together are quite substantial and quite detailed in terms of walking people through step by step how you might approach this. And so the function of today is to try to close that out with any questions that people may have or additional information that they might be seeking. So that's the background. It was remiss of me not to acknowledge that in Australian custom, at least, when we run an event, particularly when there are international visitors, we do like to acknowledge that this event is taking place on the lands of the traditional custodians of land. In my particular case, this is Adelaide and the Kaurna people. So I acknowledge elders past, present and emerging in that regard. So I'll now hand over to Michael. I think, Michael, the intention is maybe to produce sort of a quick overview for those who haven't yet fully had a chance to digest the materials that are online, and then we'll open for questions. If people want to put things in the chat session, that's fine too. I'll do my damnedest to keep an eye on that and also try and harness it as well. So over to you, Michael.
Okay, thank you, Lynn. Yeah, so I've got some flexibility on how you want to run this, in the sense that we sort of set it up and I thought we'd do this in this sort of flipped mode, whereby rather than you all just sitting there listening to me for an hour and a half, talking to slides, you could look at those at your own leisure from off the website. But recognizing, and if everybody has done that, then I'm not going to do any slides at all. So I'm going to perhaps dangerously throw this open to democracy, and perhaps might say, but I've also got perhaps 20 minutes of just running through the slides, taking out highlights of the slide presentation, and just stepping us through that. And if people want me to do that, then I'll do that. I think that should take no more than 20 minutes just to quickly run through that. So I suppose what I'd be interested to see is a show of hands, as in on there's the thumbs up option, isn't there, down on the reactions. If you would like me to run through that, a quick sort of run through, then could you indicate? And if absolutely nobody puts their thumb up, I'm going to say, okay, ask me questions. Okay, ask me questions, guys. But if people do have a preference for doing that, okay, I'm seeing some coming through.
Yeah.
Okay, yes.
So people are indicating that I think their preference is to give a quick overview to, so even if they have sat through the material, I think a quick brush up is probably not a bad idea.
Okay, so I'll do that. So it means I'm now going to share my screen, come across into that one, and hope the technology. My machine always prefers now to pause for a while and changes everything while it does that. Can everybody now see my?
Yep, that's good, Michael.
My screen, yeah. Okay.
Yes, Michael.
Good, thank you. And I would say, although I'm going to whip through, in the sense that I want this to be interactive, even on this whip through part, if there's people who've got a question about something, just open up your mic and just ask a question as we go. I think that would be the way to go. So, yeah, so I'm Michael Burton, School of Ag and Environment at UWA. Been working on various elements of these sort of valuation techniques and getting more into this, the best worst scaling approach. Come on. I would like you to move on for me, please, now. Okay, that's interesting. It was working perfectly, 30 seconds. Ah, there we go. Okay, find the right button. So as Lynn said, yes, this is the project that this came out of. And some of the results I'm going to show and talk about are ones that have come from that project. So the structure in terms of the original sets of slides and recordings had these 5 main issues: the conceptual stuff, how we think about the way people make choices, interpretation, presentation. This afternoon, I'm going to skip the bit about 4, the anchors and absolute ranks, although we can come back and talk about that if people want to. And then a quick bit on how to implement. So overarching conceptual issue. What does best worst scaling do? It's a way of basically generating a ranking. It's a way of producing a quantified ranking, so a numerical scale between the items, not just ordered 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, but actually some sort of numerical measure of where things sit on that scale. It's particularly useful if you've got a large number of items you want to scale. If anything, I'd actually say you shouldn't use it if you've only got 5 or 6. It's particularly powerful when you've got 20 or 30, say, that you want to get people to scale. It's been shown to be more efficient, more reliable in various measures than other methods like Likert scales. And so that's why it's becoming more attractive. 3 different ways, different types of doing this best worst scaling, which are known as in the literature as case 1, case 2, case 3. We're just going to focus entirely on this case 1, which is the object one. So you just have to the reason for saying that is you have to be a bit careful. If people just say, oh, well, I'm doing a best worst scaling, you may just want to ask the question, okay, which version are you talking about? Because they may be talking about a different one to the case 1. So just you should be clear as to what that is.
So on that point, Michael, is it worth talking just briefly about how important it is to get that decision right? So I'm assuming that if you think you're doing case 2 and you're actually doing case 1, that potentially could lead you to sort of, if you're the person running the experiment, it potentially creates a few catastrophes for you down the track. So yes, and the case 1 is particularly the case where you've got discrete objects. So in our case, it was like different policy interventions. So it would be something like this, where it's the most and least preferred services that you particularly want from your water provider, as in it's like a set of objects that you can think about. The other ones are more like profiles, where you're saying what are the best characteristics of a product or whatever. So again, that's going to be framed as to what type of question you're asking and what you want to have answered. And if you don't have, if you pick the wrong one, thinking you're going to get a particular answer, say, so in particularly, the case 1 will not give you monetary values. If you're hoping to get a part where the dollar value, case 1 will not do that for you. At least the simple versions of it won't give that for you. Whereas case 3 is like a discrete choice experiment, it will. So yes, you definitely need to be sure as to what your research question is and which one then you're going to pick. So this is an example of a case 1. You want to rate a number of objects. This is a very quick, if you like, pitch as to what people see. You see a subset of the items and they have to pick their least and their most. It's just a binary choice. And the reason it's seen as being so easy or beneficial for people is that's a simple thing to do, not asking you to put it on a scale. Just you're going to see repeated versions of this. Just tell me which one is your best or worst or most preferred, least preferred out of these 4 items, and then off you go. So we need to have these subsets. What I'm going to do is that I've got the full slide case here, but I've put into red the ones I'm not going to talk about. So if you come back later and say, yes, but I'll be able to do it, but I'm basically going to skip anything that's got a red title on it. That's why I'm skipping through. I wanted to keep the full set so that you could ask me questions about the bits I'm skipping. If you've already prepared a question about slide 7, I can come back to it. So Michael, just if you go back one slide really quickly, we'll close out a question that's come up already. So back one more, back rather than forward, but there. So for example, well, even that one's fine. So in this particular case, you've got a subset where people are making choices of best and worst, and you've got 4 as that subset. Yep. So a question has come up to say, well, what's the recommendation with respect to the number per subset? In per subset. Okay, so there's been work that's done on this. You could think you could go down to 2, which would give you which is sort of just the pairwise comparison. 3 is sort of more efficient because you get a complete ranking across 3 items. If you go up to a lot more like 8, if you've got 30 items and you put 8 into a set, you know something about the relative rankings, but you're losing information about the relative values on the internal 6. You know that they're all preferred to the worst one and they're all worse than the best one, but you're not getting any information on the relative ranking. So you sort of quickly lose some efficiency by going into the larger numbers. The recommendation seems to be 4 or 5 in the set, and cognitively that's probably
what you could think that people could process quite quickly, rather than having to read through a massive list of these things, because they are going to have to do a lot of them. So yeah, typically the stuff that we've done, it's been 4.
Okay, thanks.
Out of the sets. Why my machine? Okay, there we go. It's okay. So this question about why do we use it? Why not use Likert scales? Likert, which is just like, give me a score on 1 to 5 as to how much you like this object, whatever. Difficult for people to maintain consistency as they do it, as in I have to keep the same scale all the way through. Different people interpret the endpoints quite often differently, as in if you say, what is, you know, your best holiday destination? Well, what does that mean? The best that I could afford or the best ever? So there's issues about how you interpret those endpoints. People tend to rate things, and this is one of the issues about on that last one, is that at times it's difficult to make people discriminate, and they say that everything's important. So if you ask an ecology what species should be protected, they will say all of them. If you say we haven't got enough money, which is the most species, they'll just simply keep on going saying all of them, as in that they do not want to discriminate. But if you've got a resource allocation problem, you have to discriminate. So you want to force some sort of discrimination if possible. And it's been shown in various things. We did this with kids, and it's more consistent, more reliable. So what's the design? Well, we have this big, long set of objects. It's repeated choices of best and worst. We need to have those subsets, and we need to actually be able to construct those subsets. We can't do the paired ones. There's simply too much stuff to do, and too many pairs if you did all of them. So what's that? As in 10 items gives 45 pairs. It's not efficient. We need a way of constructing these small sets out of the full list. And there are these designs. And so this is a really important thing, is that you can't just, in the same way as sort of any experimental scientific design, you can't just go and arbitrarily put these together. You want to actually pick up designs that have good properties. And the version that is most commonly used now are these balanced incomplete block designs, BIBIDs. They've got more than 2 items in each of the questions, the block. There's balance, which means that each item turns up an equal number of times. Each item turns up with the other items equally, as in the pairs turn up, but it's not a full factorial, because a full factorial would be crazy. If every item turned up with every other possible combination of objects, that goes massive. So, but these designs, they're balanced on a sort of that at the pairwise. Catalogs exist for finding these things. So you can just go and find a book, or actually the software will generate them for you. And there's just like literally a catalog of designs that you can go pick up and find what the combinations are. So that's really important. If you don't get that bit right, then later on your statistics or whatever won't work, because you haven't got a proper design. This is the bit, so I'm going to skip. This is all about issues about how you put the designs together. But basically that's what we want. We have a nice big long list of items, maybe 20 items. We're going to construct a set of these choice questions, 4 items in them. Each person's going to have to answer not lots, but a number of these. So they could be seeing 10, 15, 20 of these binary choice questions. So they need to be prepared for the fact that, okay, guys, these are simple questions, but you're going to have to see a lot of them. You can block it so that you don't. So if you've got, if working, say, with people who are time poor or farmers, or you just think they're not going to sit here and comply and just work with me on this, then you can split them up into subsections. So each person will only see a small set of the complete design. They may only see 4 out of the 20 questions in your design. But when you put everybody together, you just treat them all as an individual who's answered all the sets.
Yeah,
so
Michael,
you can do that. Michael,
there's still a little bit more chat about the, I think people are looking for a definitive answer. And I'm trying to point out that there's a bit of compromise around the edges here, that on the one hand, you could have lots of items that people are comparing on the screen, which will give you some data, but that's probably not good either. for, as you explained, like, you know, that if you get to 8, or you're really just discerning is the best and worst, and then you don't know anything much about the other 6 that are in the middle. Then there's the cognitive balance about how many people can actually look at in one group and discern, and then how many times you're going to ask them to look at different combinations. So I think what people probably need to understand is there's, you know, a lot of this is about sort of compromise and testing, and particularly different cohorts with farmers, if they're, you know, how interested are they in the topic, etc. So it might be worth just sort of teasing that out a little bit.
Yeah. So there's sort of a almost an ideal in some sense in that if you can get each person to see each item 4 times, then the advice is, well, you might be able to actually generate individual specific rankings. So what that means, if I've got 20 items and I have 4 items in each choice set, in each block, if I could get them to do 20 questions, then essentially they will have seen each item 4 times, or lots of different combinations, but item 1 will have turned up 4 times. And if you can get them to do that, then in principle, you could, if you wanted to, report the analysis at the individual level. So you'd get some sort of measure of differences between the different people in the different groups. So you could potentially get a rating for each of the people in the score and see how much those differ across the different people. So there's sort of, for me, there's sort of this a bit of a stretch objective of can you get them to do as many questions as you've got items? Because if you could get them to do that, then in principle you could go and actually start thinking about estimating what a ranking for each person. If you then come back and say yes, but as in I'm not going to get a farmer who's time poor and doesn't really see hasn't bought into the point of doing this to answer the 20 questions, then you might say, okay, I need to split this up into 5 groups of 4 questions. We're in and out quick. I can't do analysis for each farmer, but when I aggregate the sample, I'll be able to do it. So if you're talking, but then if you're talking about an expert who's or a policymaker or whoever who's got real commitment and understanding, then you may be able to, with sufficient priming, to say, look, this is why we're doing this. This is why I'm asking lots of questions. There's a reason to do this. Please hang on in there. That you may be able to get somebody to actually complete 20 of those sets and still get meaningful numbers out from them. So I think it is very much about who the respondent is. You obviously, more is always better. And so, but you definitely need to test this to see at what point do their eyes glaze over and they're no longer engaging with you. And otherwise they're just going to start hitting the button, giving you random answers because they just want to get through this. So it's definitely, you need to judge who your respondents are and what they can cope with. But more is better if you can get it.
Yeah, thanks. There's another question in the chat, but I think we might just sit on that for now, and that might resolve when we actually explain what the design, what one actually looks like.
Okay.
People might then get a sense of how it differs from other techniques.
Okay, if you want how it looks like, do I need to come back up to? Because that was one of the things I was going to skip. Perhaps I might, let me just look at the comments.
The last comment, Michael, by Prakashan.
Okay, is it relative ranking of best within fixed? Okay, right. Okay, then I will come to the idea of reference levels and what we're going to get out. Okay, yeah, I can. I will move on. Okay. That's all about design. Models of choice and the ways to analyze it. So what we've got now is we've got respondents have been asked to identify the best and the worst from their subset of their 4, best, worst, or whatever, most, least, whatever the framing is. The assumption is that in their heads, they've got some latent measure as to what is the degree of better and worst, and that's what they've used to actually do this ranking. So they in their heads, they can put all these items on a line, and then when you show them 4 of them, they just pick up which one is the best and which is the worst. So conceptually, this model says, I've got some underlying measure of preference, and they pick the one which has got the highest and the lowest. This looks then like a discrete choice, a conditional or mononomial logit model, where I can construct a probability that they've picked an item. So this just says the probability they picked item I out of the set as being best is a function of the betas are my underlying utility, my preference ranking that I've got in my head, and which we're trying to reveal. It's just this sort of logit formulation. It's the exponential of that particular I divided by the sum of the exponential of. So this has got nice properties. It's a probability. It adds up. It lies between 0 and 1. They all add up to, across all the items. They add up to 1. So they have nice properties. The worst one is simply the same expression, but with the signs flipped. So I'm going to pick the one which is the worst. So I just multiply it by -1 and it suddenly becomes the largest. So I can just have a model as to how I've picked the best versus the worst. And now this just looks to me like a statistical model that I can just work with. I know that they saw 4 items. They picked 1 as best. What's the probability they did that? It depends upon these weights. They picked 1 as worst. What's the probability they did that? Well, it depends upon the inverse of those weights, the negative of those weights. So now I'm in a quite comfortable statistical world where I have a conceptual model as to how they make choices based upon these weights. And if you're happy with these conditional or mononomial or conditional logit models, they're just standard in most software that you can just estimate one of these. You're picking 1 out of many. And what gets revealed out of that process are these betas. They are simply the weights attached to an item. So I can very quickly go from this data collection process of making these choices among sets to a statistical model of can I retrieve the underlying scores that I've got in terms of the, and you can see this isn't coming up as a ranking, it's coming up as a coefficient, a weight essentially. And that's what's going to give us a quantitative measure of where things sit on a line, not just which one out of these is better than the others. So that is really comfortable for me because I'm suddenly back into a world of statistical models that I'm really comfortable with. There are various different framings of that models, MaxDiff, sequential, and so on. How to use best and worst, as in I'm going to keep on going and just talk about what that model would look like in the simplest version of this. As in if I've just got all these choices, these different sets, what do I do? Well, I have to drop one of them. I think this is coming back to the relative versus absolute thing. These measures, these betas are only going to be relative to each other. They're not absolutes. They are relative to they're going to get the relative weights of the items across the sets. So I have to drop one of them. I have to use one as a base. I have to set its weight to 0. Doesn't matter which one you drop, but then everything else is then measured relative to the one I've dropped, the one you've chosen as base. So the preference now give preference ratings for objects relative to the base. So if you're to estimate a model, okay, that's okay, I'm skipping. This is what the output looks like. So this is, in fact, this is actually from one of our project outcomes, but I have these variables, D1 to D9. They are measuring I think this is not one which had 10 objects in it. Object 10 has been dropped. And what we end up with these coefficients is something which tells us what the weight is relative to D10, which is dropped at 0. So what we can see is that numerically, object 1, positive, it's valued more than the baseline object 10. We can talk about statistical significance. It's definitely statistically different to object 10. We can then see these ones which are negative. Object 4, really not liked, large negative coefficient. But actually on this set, as in, there's quite a lot of stuff which looks as if they haven't discriminated between things. So we can get some statistical measure actually of degree of discrimination across the objects. So we can see these different, these weights are telling us something about the relative value of the object relative to the one I've dropped as the base. And they're also telling me whether I've got different statistical differences between objects in terms of relative to each other. So here we're getting, that's where we're going to end up with something which is more than just a first, second, third, fourth type of ranking.
Yeah, so maybe just worth going back over that again in terms of emphasising its difference from, say, a standard Likert ranking.
Yes. So
what could I do? What can I do with this that I can't do with a Likert ranking?
So what this is going to, so Likert ranking would give me the relative scores across the, well, the Likert ranking is going to give me relative scores in terms of numerical ones across. So it's on a score from 1 to 5, it's going to tell me what the value is. In principle, numerically, I'm going to be able to actually discriminate and say, well, assuming a 5 is a lot better than a 1, if that's the score. So the problem with the Likerts isn't that it's couldn't necessarily put things on a scale. It's just that the process is it's not a reliable way of putting things on that scale. So so in that sense, the Likert, which potentially does give you a numerical number, in principle, you could say, well, that's going to give me just a numerical scoring as well, a 10 versus an 8 versus a 6 versus a 1. True. What this is, but the claim is that the best worst scaling is a better scale, a more reliable scale to be, numerical scale to be sitting on. What this is going to do in terms of that numerical is going to be better than just say, give me a list of items, just order them, just rank them on a scale from 1 to 10, just tell me which order these are in. You could do that with these 10 objects, but then all I know is that object 1 is definitely better than object 2, which is better than object, no, it's 1, 8. But you can see statistically, I could put that ranking on, but statistically, I'm actually saying, well, actually 2, 8, and 10, although I could rank them, are actually not that different to each other, as in they're not that separated in my preference ranking. Whereas I definitely know that 1 is out there preferred more, and 4 is definitely out there at the bottom and isn't valued very much at all. So that's where I'm getting the extra power, is to be able to statistically differentiate between the objects. That said, this doesn't force you to discriminate. So if you genuinely either didn't care or actually had an equal preference, the statistics will just come back saying, I'm detecting no ranking across these objects that you've given me. So it's not forcing there to be discrimination, but if there is discrimination, I can actually numerically put it onto the scale. And this one, perhaps this was a bad example, and there was so little discrimination in here. Perhaps I should have chosen one to show you, which had got much more in terms of the
Michael, a quick question.
Yep.
Let's say if I were to compare D4 and I'm looking for another -1 or +1, D9, let's say, they're both somewhat significant. Can I say that D4 is significantly less preferred than D9? Because we are comparing each to D10, but if I were to compare D4 and D9, can I do that just with the coefficient size?
You would need to do you would need to do a bit of an extra test, because you'd want to formally test whether D4 and D9 are different. So, but in post estimation, I can do that because I can just statistically do that check. You could imagine actually, and people don't actually do this, and I haven't, is that you could do all pairwise comparisons. In principle, I could do now statistically. I could go through and say, although at the moment I've done everything to 10, you could say, is D1 different from 2 to 3 to 4 to 5? And actually, if you think of sort of the ANOVA type output, I could potentially report for somebody all possible pairwise comparisons and their statistical significance. Okay, and it's interesting that I don't think I've ever seen anybody actually do that. But you could do it, and it would be quite an interesting thing to do. But yeah, in principle, you can. The way you could reveal that also is just by changing the baseline that you've dropped. I could have, if I dropped D, whichever one you picked, D6, it would then have done the comparison between D. But you could, yeah, you can definitely do that. You can do all the pairwise comparisons.
Michael, there is a question
Michael,
on how is it better than DC. Yeah, sorry. There's a question in the chat box. Yeah, the last one.
Now, Avinash, I was saying that whether D1 or D2 is different from D3, maybe the world test. That's what Michael was saying. So I just was trying to get reconfirmation that whether it's true.
Sorry, say that again. I was just looking in the chat box. I was trying to multitask and failing.
No, Michael, I said that what Avinash was saying, I was following. For example, if we want to see that whether D2 is different than D3, and then we can do the standard world test, that what we do in econometrics, right?
Yeah, exactly. Okay. So I use something called Stata. I could run through basically all those pairwise comparisons and pop them all out. The question in the chat box is about different to a discrete choice experiment. This looks a lot like a discrete choice experiment, which is basically a type 3, a case 3 best worst scaling you could think of. So what this doesn't give you is any monetary values compared to a DCE, because there's no cost in here, and we're not asking them to make trade-offs between items. We're asking them just to rate them or give a preference ranking across them. So you can do the case 3 best worst scaling is essentially a discrete choice experiment where you ask them to pick the best and the worst out of the sets, the choice sets. It's more efficient. You get more information by doing that, by going to that form compared to a normal discrete choice experiment. So this is in some sense simpler for the this is simpler for the respondents, but you will end up getting less information out of it in terms of the price that we're getting no price information. It also, in a discrete choice experiment, you're sort of thinking you can put together a bundle, a profile of things. And then you're choosing between bundles with a different price. It's not always possible, as in if we're trying to compare policies, okay, what am I going to do? I can say, well, you can, here's a policy, here are 5 different policies, or I've got 20 different policies and here's 4 of them that are going to be bundled together. That may not make any sense. They may be mutually exclusive. So that issue may not work well. There's some cases where actually going to a discrete choice experiment in the traditional form may not make any sense. Yeah, you need to decide what it is, where and what you want to get to.
So I guess it's really important to emphasize that with this type of technique, you're not really looking to get marginal rates of substitution in dollar terms. So if the object is to put something back in a benefit cost analysis, this is not going to serve its purpose. However, if the question is one of, okay, we've already decided, so if it's more of a cost effectiveness choice, that is to say, we've already decided to do something, now we want to understand what people value most if we respond, it'll give you a sense of ranking around that.
Of the order.
And the other really useful application of this I've seen is your work with Dan, where you looked at the likelihood of farmers adopting something or doing something. And so in that case, it's a very powerful tool in terms of thinking about what farmers are most likely to do and least likely to do. And so it can be a very powerful instrument in that regard as well.
Yeah. Right, I'm not in there. Okay, so this is just about this is the statistical stuff, the value of the base you can retrieve. So this is the, and I could change the values. there's an advantage in the approach in that you don't necessarily have to do the statistical models. So in the text, the Louvier, whatever, they're quite clear and saying, before you get into any statistical models, really you ought to just to do some simple numerical analysis. And this idea of just doing counts, and all the counts is saying, how many times was an object chosen as best, minus the number of times it was chosen as worst, divided by the number of times that it was seen, either by the individual, if you do this personally, or if you on a per person, or just across the entire sample. So this is just basically counting number of times best minus number of times worst divided by the number of times seen. And that's been shown to be actually really closely correlated with the stats. So this is an example out of the project. We actually had a small number of items, only 8, sort of on the limit of what you might think of as why we'd need to do this. It wasn't 30 or 40, it was small. It was set up like this, and obviously they were just picking the best and the worst. And we got them to do a lot because they were experts. So we forced them in to do, got them to commit. There was a hope to do this with farmers, but we didn't get there for obvious reasons. And then we had 3 jurisdictions, and I'm just showing you the ones from Nepal. So this is basically the conditional logit results. What comes out of this, we dropped as the base, easier access to modern technology. That's the one we don't use. And then we have the relative scores relative to that. And here you can start to see there is a bit more discrimination. There's one thing which isn't different to that one. More stable farm output prices, and then there's some items which are seen as really positive and some are then relatively negative. So again, I can put these things on a line. You can see it works with a fairly small number of people, 37. They did lots of these questions, so we've got 296 answers out of them. I think they all did 8 of the questions. So that's really good because we get that sort of high level of responses, even though we've got a small number of people. But then what we can do is we could just do the same thing as with the counts. So this is the number of times the item 1 was seen, number of times it was best, number of times it was worst. We can do that score. I've got 2 different versions of the score there, but this is just Excel. Basically, this is just counting. And here comes this scoring sequence. And it turns out this is the correlation. So along the bottom here is the conditional logit results parameters, which have obviously got 1 at 0. So that's my item 8. And that's in the last one out of the list. And then on the vertical axis, it's the scores we got from the count system. And you can see they're sitting basically on a straight line, not perfect, but they're incredibly closely related. So actually, you can get information out from this data, which is very closely linked or related to what you can get out from a statistical model just by doing that count process. So in terms of if you wanted to explain to somebody or to justify what these weights are, it's really easy to communicate this. It's in some sense that best minus worst, which is a measure of the relative value of these things across my sample, divided by the, made into a proportion. And you can see that they line up, not perfectly, but really closely to the statistical models. Obviously,
so this obviously is applicable to case 1. So there's a few questions coming up around, sort of case 3 and so forth. So it's important to emphasise this, what we're talking about here is only case 1. Only
case 1, yes. If you've gone to case 3, then you're going to need to do the normal model of the statistical models of trading off the different alternatives. You're going to get marginal values for all the attributes and the cost, and you can then interpret in the normal way. The advantage of it is you're just getting more information out of it because you're getting not just which of the 3 alternatives was the best, but also which one was worst, and then you get a complete ranking across all the items.
Yeah, so I guess, again, to emphasise, with case 3, it's ostensibly the choice model that we've become used to, with the exception that you're asking the respondent not just which would they prefer, but which are they going to shy away from most.
Yes.
Which do they least prefer as well?
So, so I think it's right looking at these, that in some sense, if you've got a case 3 best worst, you've essentially completely converged onto a discrete choice experiment, except you've extended it and said, I'm going to actually ask them a second question, not just which is my best one out of this set, but which is the worst out of the set, the best one. But it's essentially, you're just asking that in a world of a normal, conventional, discrete choice experiment. And that used to be a bit of the flavor of the month a few years ago, that everybody was adding that in, and it seems to have stopped in the literature. You're no longer seeing people doing that as often, which is interesting as to, okay, how does it look like in case 3? Okay, perhaps, do you want me to go back up to see? It looks like
you just answered that question.
Yeah, okay. It looks like a classic discrete choice experiment with 2 choice questions. Which of these objects is of these alternatives is best? Which one is worst? So
and really, any reason it dropped out of favor, Michael? You said that it was the flavor of the season, and then it dropped out.
I don't know.
What was the main critique?
I don't know. I think there were some issues that people, when they tested it, they were finding that the utility function was different for when people were making the best choices and the worst choices. So that they were inconsistent in terms of the way that people were making. The rationalization of the best choice was different to the rationalization of the worst choice, which is really problematic if you're building a world where you think that they have a utility function and they look at these items and they can rank, they value all the items, and they in their heads pick the one that looks best. That process should be the same when they look at the items and decide which one's worse. But it seems as if when you look at the examples that people do seem to change the utility function in their head when they were picking the best and the worst. So I think that might be why it's actually sort of, but that would be interesting. That's a paper, isn't it? Go and look at the literature and see whether that has, if my intuition's right, and whether it has dropped out. Okay, back to the case 1. You can basically get the same information out doing the 2 processes, the statistical model or doing the count versions. And so there's a benefit in terms of simplicity, and it might be actually easier to communicate. If you imagine you're trying to put this back out into your stakeholders or whoever, explaining what you've done, if you just say, well, these scores are based upon this relative preference. How often do we say it's best, worst? That may be easier to do than start saying, I've estimated a conditional logit model. And so the communication parts. So what are the advantages? The counts, they're simple. They can be used with individual data, which sometimes the stats will sometimes fail on. But the econometrics, it lets you do lots of nice stuff. You can formally test for differences across the sample. So we were doing those tests across our 3 different jurisdictions. Were they different in the 3 different jurisdictions? Yes, we could formally test that. You can do some interactions, as in, does age change the ratings for these items or whatever it might be? So you can do the statistics in terms of comparing the values. So depending on my preference is to head down the econometric route, but potentially the counts route is also open. Okay, interpretation. I've got these scores, whether it's by counts or whether it's by the statistical model. Well, how am I going to communicate this? How am I going to try to convince somebody as to what I've got and how to think about it? What do the estimates mean? Well, the thing is, this comes, I think, back to the earlier one. These are only relative weights of objects. They're not absolute weights. It's not as if I've sort of got some scale on which I'm absolutely saying this has got a value to it. It's not like having a monetary value where I know what naught means and I know what $10 means. I know what $1,000 means. they're all relative to themselves. It's all comparative. So I can put them on a line, but I can't have, so it's a ratio scale. It's not, I can't use it as a ratio scale. It has no absolute zero to these numbers. So people are aware of that, but they want, if possible, to put it onto a ratio scale. So they have these things called the scaled probability scores, which are about effectively, what's the probability that somebody would have picked this as best? Is the best way to think about how these work. And they're a simple reformulation of the Logit scores. So you can just turn the handles, you rescale them so they all add up to 100. And what pops out are these quite nice, you can produce these quite nice sort of distributions. And here, this is for that data, but now I've got all 3 jurisdictions, Bangladesh, Nepal, India in there. And it's just basically, say, telling you what the relative value is of these. In a probabilistic sense, what's the probability that you would pick this as the most important compared to? So now I can compare these across the items. I can compare them with the items. I still don't have something equivalent to a value, a monetary value, though. So I can still only talk about internally within my set as to what my relative values are. But you can and if I've done this using the econometrics, I can formally tell you that, well, these 3 different groups of experts are different from each other in terms of what they rate. But now I'm able to sort of communicate, well, where is that? So what was the big one? India didn't see cheap inputs as being important, and they were much more about moving off farm to non-farm income sources. This is about how to improve sustainability, increasing and making more sustainable farmers' incomes. What interventions would be best to achieve that? So you can start to unpack and see where people are actually different across your different sample groups. And this is quite often the most common way of reporting these values back out to people. So they can be interpreted as a ratio scale. If it's twice as big, it's twice as likely to be picked. So you can see really this cheap inputs is really a third or a quarter as valued as the access to inputs for the India sample. So we can start to talk in those terms. They're influenced by what's known as the scale parameter, the noise. If you've got just random people, not random people, if you've got people who are very uncertain about their preferences, or they just want to get rid of you by ticking the boxes fast so that you just go away and leave them alone, what will happen is that these scales will just come out as being flat. And you'll see no discrimination across the object. So it's not forcing there to be discrimination, but if either they don't discriminate either for good reasons or bad, it will just turn up as a flat score. So in that case, they'd all be coming up at 12.5, which is sort of the average across all the items. So in principle, you can interpret these relative to the 12.5 line, which is what would I have got if there'd been no discrimination between the items.
And 12.5 is 100 by 8, right? The
Yeah.
number of items you had. Okay.
Yeah. So it just goes to the equal one. Okay. Alternative framings. You can do fancy stuff. You can ask the same question lots of times. Part 4 in it was about trying to put absolutes on. So that was about putting that was about checking for best and worst, differences in variances. Anchoring, you can ask questions saying, would you ever implement this policy, or is it actually worthless? And you can use that to put anchors into the system. So I've skipped over that a bit. What's the time? Yeah, okay.
Okay, Michael, there's a few questions that have come up in the chat which probably are worth addressing.
Yeah.
Michael, one more thing. Can we stay a little longer? Let's say 5 or 10 minutes if possible.
Of course.
Okay, thank you.
I'll stay here for as long as there's people on the other end of the line.
Okay, thank you. Thanks.
Lynn but Lynn can just leave me to close it down. No, I'm happy. I've got nothing coming after this, so I'm happy to stay for as long as you want to talk. Well, within some reasons, perhaps.
Yeah. I'm sure we can extend another 15 minutes without too much.
Certainly.
There's a few technical questions there that you probably will well positioned to answer, like in terms of model specifications and those sorts of questions. So can we use more complex multinomial logic models for preference analysis?
Michael, do you want me to read out the question, the first one?
I think his microphone might have died. Can you hear us, Michael? So while Michael's trying to recover his audio, there's a question there about can we use this technique? Is this a technique that's suitable for phone use, I think, for phone administration? So in that regard, we did have a little bit of experience in this context. What we ended up doing, though, was using a basic paired comparison. So we did do one experiment in West Bengal, where originally we had designed it to be implemented as a best worst scaling with about 4 to 6 items that farmers would pick from. With COVID, we were unable to do that and administer it in person. So we ended up converting that into a paired comparison where the phone enumerator basically gave the respondent only one, they could only pick out of 2, which they favoured most. So I guess, there's compromise in the technique in that regard. So we weren't able to present the full 4 to 6, which we originally had designed. But in terms of given the necessity to administer it by phone, we managed to collect some data that did model. It still worked fine. Not as ideal as what we would have intended in the first instance, but it can be adapted for phone application. But you do need to keep in mind that you might reduce it to just a simple paired comparison. I don't know whether Michael has managed to retrieve his audio or not. So while he was bragging about being very generous with his time, he disappeared off.
Lynn, if someone in the group, who is familiar, if they can address some of those comments, that would also be good by the time Michael is back.
Sure. Well, the practicality of doing this method over the phone, well, I've answered that. Yes, you can do it over the phone, but you really need to cut back. So you're probably limited to a paired comparison only, or maybe you might get away 3. As with all of these techniques, and I can't emphasise this enough to anybody that hasn't been involved much with these sort of discrete choice experiments, as with all of them, and Avanish will comment on this as well, I think the front end of it is so important. That's really where most of the work has to go. It's not a simple technique to just roll out quickly, and you can undertake a choice experiment quite quickly. But at the end of the day, if you don't ask the right questions and have the right attributes, it's really difficult to retrieve anything useful. So anybody who's been doing discrete choice for a while, I don't think that has changed from the early days of discrete choice. It's still very much about getting the right attributes and the right design. Otherwise, regardless of the improvements in statistical software, it's pretty hard to retrieve anything when you've asked the wrong questions. In slide 23, well, sorry, I can't help you with slide 23. Internal consistency. Are there post-estimation and robustness checks I'm not the statistician here. Bethany, you're here, but I'm not sure whether you're able to answer that in the context of.
Hey, Lynn, can
yes,
Michael
Wes.
join over phone if his computer is ditching him?
Michael's one of those really weird guys that doesn't have a mobile phone.
Oh, okay, sorry.
He's a Luddite. So, and I don't understand because he was actually still in the. Just bear with me a sec. Yeah. So one of the, and again, perhaps it was a little because of the rush presentation. I'd encourage people to go back and look through the slides that Michael had prepared. But we do use a lot of visuals in this as well. So there is the option. Some of the experiments that Michael presented were designed for experts. So we didn't necessarily have to have a lot of visuals in there. But if you are using them with farmers or lay people, the use of visuals can also be very powerful and included, and that can also help. But again, I can't emphasize enough the importance of making sure that you trial all those in advance and that you're very careful in terms of their design.
Hi, Lynn, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
That was in whatever we've been doing, 2 years of doing Zoom meetings. That was an interesting experience. Just got a sound as if there was a road breaker in my headphones and the machine just refused to respond. So I've had to jump across to a different machine that has no camera.
That's okay.
That's fine, Michael.
Okay.
Michael, there is one question on how to do robustness checks to see if the preferences reported were consistent, like internally consistent. Is there some quick way to do that? Internally
consistent.
Meaning I am not choosing something as best the ranks are like follow the usual, what is that rule called? The preference orders do not change a whole lot.
The transitivity one?
Yes, the transitivity, thank you, yes.
So in principle, I'm just getting myself back up and getting this PowerPoint organized. In principle, you could do, so for each person, you could check to see whether or not there was transitivity across their choices they've made, because obviously they've done a ranking on binary and you could check. Again, I haven't seen anybody do that particularly vigorously or rigorously. There's the framing for these is sort of like a random utility model. So there's almost an assumption that there's some sort of noise in this. So the fact that they didn't select it perfectly wouldn't necessarily mean that you'd want to dismiss the data, because you might say, well, just you expect to see a bit of noise. It will manifest itself on whether or not you're seeing discrimination, in the sense that if they are just picking at random, then you will just get that flat line. The problem is, and this was raised by somebody saying, well, what happens if I genuinely not picking at random, but I just value everything equally? Well, that will also reveal for yourself a flat line, basically. And I think that's, so I think that then is an issue about, is it possible for you to detect whether people are genuinely just acting, making bad choices, quick choices, or are they just revealing, I actually can't discriminate between these things? So that, or actually I do. So that I think is a question. But in principle, you could go through, and again, I said I haven't seen people do this, where to actually check the transitivity internally within each person's questions. In some sense,
are you able to see the chat box, Michael, or would you like?
I can probably see the chat box better now because I'm no longer looking at my slides. But I will try to share the slides again in a minute. Oh, okay. Let's.
So there's a question based on slide 23, yes. And then there's a follow up by Prakashan. Yeah.
Okay, I'm gonna make a risk and actually You're going to need to let me back in to share screens, Lynn, because I'm a different person.
Oh, okay.
When I've come
Oh,
back
there you
in, it's brought me back in as a different person. I'm on a different machine. So
okay, there you
go. I want to share that one. Okay. In order that I can see the questions as well, I might not.
Slide 23, I think was the question.
Yeah. In terms of how we're going to stack the data?
Yes, slide 23.
Okay.
That's 11. Yeah, go down. Yes, 23, right there. Above that, above the current one. Yes, that.
Okay. Let's see if I can make that bigger. You can see that?
Yep.
Yes, we can.
That's fine.
Okay. So the way the coding happens, so it just in terms of a quick run through as to what we're looking at, the ID is the person. The ones are going to be, or these are going to be the sets, and we're going to identify whether or not it's about a best set or a worst set using that coding of a 1 for a best, a minus for. There's then 3 options 1, 2, and 3, and then in this coding, the option in the best, it was the first object that was picked. So you can see the choice there is a 1, and then the other 2 weren't picked. And so when we look at the worst data, we've actually only got 2 items rather than 3, because item 1 has been dropped out. So it was objects 2, 4, and 8, and now it's only 4 and 8. And what we see is that the choice of the worst one is still a 1. So the outcome variable in terms of is it a 0 or a 1 still indicates that it's been chosen. But the difference is here in the stack data, for when it was the worst choice, these codings for the object dummies have been switched from being a +1. So it was +1 because it was number 2, a +1 because it was 4, a +1 because it was 8. And then in the worst set, it's a -1 because it was a 4 and a -1 because it was object 8. So that mapping, so this data, basically the data that's in the estimation is this block on the right-hand side. It's what were the objects that were present revealed by a 1 or a -1, and a choice which is a 0 and 1. But the 0 1s are always 0s or 1s to indicate the choice was is always a 1. So what differentiates the best from the worst is the fact that in the worst, the objects are coded as -1. It's like that, just that flip. So this is sort of, go on, yeah?
No, go ahead. Please go ahead, complete it. Yeah.
I'm going to see if I fire that up. Can you still see that?
Yep.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm now very nervous about my technology. So what you can see is that so this is what's meant by stacked. So I think I saw in the comments, okay, is this data been stacked? Yes, it's been stacked because in the first question, there's a set of data which is reflecting the choice they made as best, and then stacked beneath it is a set of data which reflects what they chose as worst. So they've been put together into the, so what you might think of as 2 data sets has actually been stacked together to make one big data set. But I can estimate, and I'm going to impose that my preference weights, my betas, are going to be the same in order to explain the choice I made for best as compared to the choice I made for the worst. And it's these little -1s which actually flip me in and out in terms of whether or not I've seen a best or a worst alternative.
So a follow-up question or a related question, Michael, is there an opt-out option, or do we have to have the respondent choosing best and worst, or can they just, like in some discrete choices, they can opt out? Is there an opt-out option in the questionnaire?
So I was nodding my head vigorously then, forgetting you couldn't see me. No, as in you have to, this is basically forced choice. They have to reveal, because you're asking them to produce a rating, and in some sense you're not asking them whether or not they want the object. They're just saying, well, out of these 4 items, which ones do you think is best and worst? And you can't say, I don't want to make a choice, or, I mean, what does an opt-out mean? I can't make a choice.
I mean, Michael, just an explanation for that question. Prakash here. Suppose a respondent sees that all the 4 options are equally important. I can make a choice between best and worst. What that respondent then do? Like right now, you are forcing them to choose between best and worst.
Yeah.
But ideally, not that case.
Well, you would. What you're going to expect to see is that, given if they're forced, is that they're going to essentially might be picking at random. So what that will do is that it will basically, if they do that consistently, whenever they see a set of objects where they can't actually discriminate between them, if I force you to make the choice, presumably you're going to say, well, I'm going to pick at random, and that's going to reveal in their responses in the statistics that they're not discriminating. As long as they don't use a heuristic, which means, well, even if they said I'm always going to pick the top one as best and the bottom one as worst, if you've got randomized in the order, that's still going to turn up as being a random pick rather than a systematic pick. But this is the thing: is that they're not allowed to. Well, they're not allowed to say they're equal. They actually have been forced to make some sort of discrimination between them.
And I guess to that point, I mean, that's really why we opted for this approach. It was because the data that we were getting back, it was very difficult for us to understand what people genuinely thought was most efficient, most effective in this particular context, and least effective. And I know Avnish would have a view on this, whether there's a cultural dimension to this as well. Like all of these techniques, I guess it's really important to also be cognizant that there's a cultural context to these that sort of circumscribes how they're presented. But certainly when we were asking the Likert scale questions, it was quite difficult to get any sort of discrimination across the data.
Oh, I've actually managed to get that plugged in. And I think that depends on, as I was saying, who it is you're asking, so that when you, my other people I work with are sort of ecologists, and they will have this problem that, as far as they're concerned, every species is equally valuable, or they're not prepared to make a statement that some species are more valuable than others. And will just want to keep on just telling you they're all important, all important, all important. I can't discriminate. Almost as a signal, they don't want to be able to signal that possibly something is less important. But actually, on a day-to-day basis, they'll be making decisions in terms of allocating resources between different outcomes. And so you're trying to sort of say, well, really, we want you to discriminate, and we know you do in day-to-day life. So please, best and worst, please rank these things, rather than just sending a signal. I mean, what you want to avoid is them sending you a signal which just says, we want to signal politically that all species are equally valuable. Even if I don't actually think that, I want to send that message down to you through the system. Well, this is going to avoid that, or make that hard for people to do.
So Michael, how does anchoring work? If I have those options and they say all 4 are important or are unimportant, what happens to the data, like econometrically?
So econometrically, what we're going to do is that we're going to be able to put this is going to put a line in the sand, or a line above and below. So there's various ways of doing this. If they've said that none of these 4 is important, so the anchor is an object which has a weight of 0. So conceptually, I draw a line in the sand and say, there's this level, which I'm going to call 0, which is the one where you move from it being important or unimportant or acceptable to me or unacceptable to me. That's this invented object, this anchor, which lies there, which has a value of 0. So what I'm going to know is statistically is that if you actually come down and say, well, none of these 4 is important, it would mean that if I had put the anchor in place, all of these things are worse than the anchor. Because none of them are important, they're all below the line. If I said all 4 are important, it means that they're all above the anchor. So if you could sort of introduce this other, it's not an opt-out, but it's an important sort of item into there, and it would mean that, well, actually, the worst thing is the anchor, because all of these 4 things are worth more than or valued higher than the anchor. If they pick the middle one, some are important, some are not, you know that the one they've picked as best must be above the anchor, and the one that's worst must be below the anchor. I don't know where the middle 2 sit, but that's okay. So statistically, you've basically added in some constructed choice sets, which say that given that they've answered these ranking ones, I know where the anchor sits relative to these items. Let's see whether it will keep me going. Okay. And what it does is, in the estimation, all of a sudden, instead of dropping one of the items, what we're going to end up with and have that as base 0, we have this thing called the anchor, which turns up as base 0. And it means that everything above that is in some sense acceptable, or and everything below it isn't. So this was an example. This is about consumer attitudes towards how to manage Campylobacter, which is a foodborne, which is a virus which gives you food poisoning. Lots of ways that you could ask farmers to change their behavior. And this is about what consumers actually would want to do. And they could rank them all, and that would have been fine. But actually, when you put the anchor in, it turns out that some things are simply not merely that they're relative, but some things are simply unacceptable. And the classic one, if anybody's familiar with British media and consumers, they really don't like the idea of dipping their chicken into chlorine water, which is what the Americans do. And the Americans would like to actually export their chicken once it's been dipped into a chlorine wash to get rid of a genuinely problematic thing. As far as British consumers are concerned, that's below the line. That's just not an acceptable thing to do. And you can see actually the interventions which are all below the line actually look quite similar. They're all about things, irradiation, ozone gas, what's that? Being frozen is thing. But so now I do have some sort of, to some extent, some sort of absolute score sitting there. And these things beneath it are simply unacceptable to me. So in a policy setting, we could have asked that question, not really asking them whether or not to rank them, but we could have asked them potentially, do you think this would actually should be implemented, or do you think this would actually significantly improve farmers' welfare? So I could rank it, but still come up and say, okay, but it's not going to do very much. It's probably not worth doing. So it gives you it re-puts into the system this notion of an absolute score. So then now, yes, I'm looking at, so now these are now all relative to, I've got the full set of items. I haven't dropped one out of, or Dan didn't drop one out of the set. These are all the items. And now the relativity, is being set relative, it's giving me my baseline of 0. So if we hadn't had an anchor in here, we'd have had to have had 11 parameters. But now we can have all 12 because we've introduced this idea of an anchor. Where's the information come to be able to have an anchor? Because we've asked all of those anchor questions. Yes.
Hi, Michael. This is Shweta. We have a couple of doubt going on in the chat box around how do we set up the anchor. So like in this slide, you have shown that all those that fall above the anchor are positives and those that fall below the anchor are turning out to be negatives. So is this something that we do before we estimate our models? We code those things as negative so that we get a negative probability, and those that we think are above as positive, so that automatically the anchor gets decided and we don't have to fix. And the other one was that because originally when we were estimating these models in the best worst setup, we were doing it in reference to a particular category, but now it doesn't seem that, right?
Yeah.
These two other questions.
Yes. So now once you put it, if you haven't got an anchor, it has to be all relative to an arbitrarily picked alternative. So if we'd guessed for this one, we might have, if we hadn't got an anchor, we would have probably said that chlorine wash is the worst. We'll use that as the anchor, and then everything's going to be positive relative to that. That's an arbitrary choice, but you could imagine doing that. But you'd have had to have dropped one of them in order to produce a baseline. As soon as you've asked these anchoring questions and you've extended the data set so that it includes the answers to the anchoring questions, then basically now we use the anchor as the baseline, and everything else is now relative to that. And I get all 12 items are now back in the list, all with numerical values, and all of them defined relative to the anchor. So the anchor actually comes in statistically, because not everybody might have actually scored it in the same way. So if you've pulled all this data together, in some sense, what we're seeing is an average response. From my sample of 500 consumers, this is representing some sort of average set of preferences across them. And the anchor has gone in at a level which best explains where their preferences sit as a group, as an average across that collective, where their preferences sit relative to that anchor. So it's not quite as, I mean, for each person. So this is an example where you ask them simply, you have the set, just say, is it acceptable or not? And they would simply go, chlorine wash, no, yes, 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 no, or whatever, through the system. But then you need to use that for an individual. It's then pretty clear where their line lies. But for a collective, if you're combining all the sample together, statistically, you're trying to find the position of the anchor which best explains everybody's choices. So it's not quite, you can't just infer where that anchor is going to lie just by looking at their answers. You're going to need statistically to estimate, well, putting it at this point between the feed additives and the ozone is the point which best rationalizes for my sample the complete sets. Yeah, so it's going to be some sort of average across the sample. In the same way, I suppose that this ranking that we're seeing here is an average across the sample.
So Michael, this idea of having anchoring, it seems to have some appealing empirical qualities, and obviously, from a straight out academic point of view, trying to be a bit more publishable, it adds a bit more flavour. I'm curious though, in terms of the respondents answering the questions, how much extra cognitive burden does this entail?
Quite a bit, because there's two versions of anchors. And there's one version where after every question, they have to answer an additional, considering just these 4 features, they need to click into that. So if you do this version of it, where you're doing this, I've forgotten what the formal name, as in the per question version of this, it's actually asking them, they're going to have to answer this 20 times. If they're seeing 20 of these choice sets, you've got to answer it 20 times. So for them, it's an added bit of extra complication. There's a version where you do this, which is just you give them the full set, and this is a subset. You can obviously see there's been some that have been cut off at the bottom. It's not the full list. Then they're just going to have to do this for each of the items. Just tell me whether it's acceptable or not. So this is probably this approach of giving them the list is possibly easier for them cognitively, but it is another set of questions they've got to answer. You also need to frame this well, in the sense of, this was, okay, for the Campi one, it was about, is it acceptable or unacceptable to you? So it's almost like, it hasn't been framed quite like this, but would you buy this product if you had known it actually had got chlorine on it? So in a policy setting, okay, you're going to have to frame that one. You're going to have to think about how you're going to frame that anchoring acceptability.
So, Michael, I have a general request, and this is not a technical question on any of these things you're showing. Is that, would it be possible, at least for this group, the 35 people who were here, to post a couple of papers and the questionnaires that went with them, so that people can look and just see more examples? And if possible, at least for one of them, that they have the do files in order that too. I understand that's like a little bit too much to ask, but if that would be possible, it will be really useful for everyone here. I understand if that won't be either. Thank you.
Well, we have, I think I'm looking at Lynn, although he doesn't know I'm looking at it. I think we're making a commitment. No, so are we going to commit to releasing data for this, as in making it public? So that would be an issue, but I think I could, from
just the code would be helpful too, Michael, okay, even if the data are not shared, and from your old non-South Asia papers too, just to get a sense and a feel of how you code it in Stata, and then some of the questions, like the different ways of anchoring. So questionnaires that you may have used, and you think instruments, I mean, survey instruments, those would be just super useful for these people. If that's good, that will become like a repository for this group, because I'm already seeing requests. People are personally messaging me that they want to collaborate with you, etc. So you're clearly evinced interest. That's why I'm requesting this.
I think probably an efficient way forward is for maybe Avanish, Michael, myself, Bethany, we might catch up later in the week and just think about what resources we can pull together quickly and easily. And that will be helpful for people. I know that often reading the academic output is really exciting and stimulating for people, but actually translating that into the doing can be a real challenge for people that are not familiar with the area. So I think we can commit to pulling together some existing resources that might help guide people, which might be useful, and give them some different examples of how to approach it. Doesn't necessarily mean that it's a complete dictionary of what's required, but it might give people that are participating in this session some direction from here. Are you comfortable with that, Michael?
Yeah. I was thinking, as in, so, and what I was going to say is that what we've covered now is like a quick whoosh across the top to see whether people are interested, or so you can see to some extent how to go about this. The next level is basically to get in terms of understanding, is to get in and play with data, and actually see how it manipulates and how it works. And more than happy to share some stuff with that. And then I suppose the next step is to say, okay, well, do you want other examples you want to do? Can you see how this might be useful? And if people are coming back saying, well, yes, I think we can see how this can be useful, then I think we've achieved a KPI of what we wanted to achieve out of doing this, to try to do that.
Cool.
And I think I'm looking at, there's some, Sweta's asked questions. Yeah, okay, interesting academic one. Yeah. Does it matter when you ask them, before, as in the framing, before or after the choice sets? I'm not sure if anybody's tested that, but that'd be an interesting one to test. As in, do you do this big long list before or after the rest of the choice sets? Does it matter? Interesting to find out. Could try that. Yeah. So you'd almost think it's bound to, because usually these things, people are sensitive to ordering.
So I think, look, it's really great that people have come along to this session, and the resource that Michael's created in terms of walking people through those slides is still available. What we'll commit to doing is catching up as a group in the next couple of days just to see what we can pull together. The website for the project will go live towards it'll be open access for everybody towards the end of the month. So we'll probably look to make that a repository where people can access some of those resources. Just finally, thank you very much, Michael. Sorry that the technical.
Yeah, no idea what my
issues.
technical glitch was. I'm glad I got a second machine.
It could be that you're recording this and you ran out of space on your computer somewhere.
I hope that's.
But also a big thank you to all of our colleagues in South Asia who have joined us, and particularly the project team that's worked hard to make sure that people were aware of this event. And thank you very much for making the time to come along. Hopefully you find it of use. Hopefully you think that we're accessible enough to be useful in your future endeavours. And thank you very much for attending. It's dark here in South Australia. I doubt whether it's dark in West Australia yet. Might be time for us to move on. Okay. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Michael, and thanks everyone in Australia.
Okay.
It must be late evening now or early evening, so we'll let you go. Thanks a lot,
Thank you.
Michael.
Thank you.
Thanks to all the participants. Yeah.
If you've got questions, I'm happy to get some emails.
Okay, cool. You might regret saying that.
Well, we'll see. If I get flooded, the response time might get quite high. But anyway,
Okay.
happy to talk to you.
Okay, thanks everybody.
Okay. And again, sorry for the technical glitch. We'll see what happens.
It's okay. Thanks.
Thank you. Thanks, Michael. Thanks, Lynn.
Okay. Lynn's gone. Okay. I was going to say, I just hope that the recording is still working despite me having been kicked out. We're going to find that out later on. Let's see if that works. Actually, we still are. Okay.